You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." Eleanor Hastings' voice carried across the sun-drenched country club terrace as she grabbed James Rivera's orange polo shirt, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric. The charity luncheon guests turned from their champagne and canapes, phones already recording as Eleanor's security guard stepped forward, his short-sleeved uniform tight across his muscular frame. "Look at them, trying to crash our event," Eleanor announced to the crowd, her red blazer catching the midday light streaming through the glass ceiling. James's wife, Diane, stood frozen in her red sundress and white slacks, watching their teenage daughter's face crumble with humiliation. The crowd laughed and whispered, designer heels clicking on marble as they circled closer for a better view. None of them knew that the Thompson Foundation's $2 million donation was the only thing keeping this charity event and Eleanor's reputation alive. Welcome to Frost Folk Tales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The morning had started so differently for the Rivera family. James had adjusted his orange polo shirt in their bedroom mirror, the crisp khaki pants completing his understated elegance. The charity luncheon invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, embossed with gold lettering announcing the annual Children's Healthcare Foundation benefit at the prestigious Magnolia Hills Country Club. His daughter Sarah had been excited to dress up, choosing her green blouse and dark pants carefully, while his son Marcus had reluctantly agreed to wear his blue dress shirt with khakis after Diane promised they'd leave early if he felt uncomfortable. Now, under the brilliant overhead fluorescent lighting mixed with natural skylight flooding through the club's glass atrium, that careful preparation felt like a cruel joke. Eleanor Hastings, the event coordinator, had spotted them the moment they'd walked onto the terrace. Her red blazer had caught the light as she'd marched across the pristine white marble floor, her face twisted with barely concealed disgust. "Excuse me," she had said initially, her voice syrupy with false politeness. "I don't believe you're on our guest list." James had smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket for the invitation, but Eleanor had stepped back as if he were carrying a weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from our guests," she had continued, her voice growing louder. "This is a private event for members and their approved guests only." That's when Diane had stepped forward, her red sundress flowing as she moved to stand beside her husband. "We have an invitation," she had said calmly, her marketing executive training keeping her voice steady despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "James Rivera, plus 3 guests, for the Children's Healthcare Foundation luncheon." Eleanor's laugh had been sharp and cutting. "Rivera?" She had looked James up and down with obvious contempt. "I know every family in this community worth knowing, and you certainly aren't one of them." Her voice had carried deliberately, ensuring the watching crowd could hear every word. "These people are trying to scam their way into our charity event." The security guard had moved closer then, his short-sleeved uniform displaying impressive muscles that seemed designed to intimidate. His hand had rested casually on his radio, ready to call for backup. "Ma'am, we need these people to leave the premises immediately," he had said to Eleanor, as if the Rivera family weren't standing right there. Sarah's face had flushed with embarrassment, her green blouse suddenly feeling too bright, too noticeable. 16 years old, an honor roll student, she had never experienced anything like this public humiliation. Her hands had trembled as wealthy patrons in designer clothes formed a loose circle around them, smartphones raised to capture the spectacle. "Mom," she had whispered, tugging on Diane's arm, "can we please just go?" But Marcus, 17 and proud, had straightened his shoulders in his blue dress shirt. "We have every right to be here," he had said, his voice cracking slightly, but firm with conviction. "We were invited. You can't just throw people out because of how they look." Eleanor's eyes had flashed dangerously. "How dare you speak to me like that, young man? Security, remove these trespassers immediately." She had turned to address the crowd of wealthy onlookers, her voice rising theatrically. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why we must maintain our standards. These people think they can just walk into our private events and make demands." The laughter from the crowd had been the worst part. Not cruel guffaws, but those polite, knowing chuckles that wealthy people use when they feel superior. Phones had continued recording as women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits had nodded approvingly at Eleanor's handling of the situation. The natural skylight streaming through the atrium's glass ceiling had illuminated every face, making the scene feel like a public trial. James had remained silent through it all, his dignity intact, despite Eleanor's increasingly aggressive behavior. But when she had grabbed his orange polo shirt, her red-painted nails actually making contact with his chest, something had shifted in the crowd's energy. Even some of the watching patrons had looked uncomfortable with the physical assault. "Get your hands off my husband," Diane had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom negotiations. Eleanor had ignored her, continuing to grip James's shirt as she addressed the security guard. "Call the police if you have to. I want these people arrested for trespassing." The marble halls had echoed with Eleanor's voice as she'd launched into a full tirade. "Do you see what happens when we lower our standards? These people probably saw our charity event online and thought they could just show up. Well, this is what integrity looks like. This is how we protect our community and our values." More phones had appeared, recording from multiple angles as Eleanor had continued her performance. Sarah had pressed closer to her mother, her face burning with shame as classmates' parents pointed and whispered. Marcus had stood straighter, his jaw clenched with righteous anger that had nowhere to go. The security guard had stepped even closer, his muscular frame casting a shadow over the family as overhead fluorescent lighting blazed down on the humiliating scene. Throughout the entire confrontation, James had said almost nothing. He had watched Eleanor's performance with calm eyes, occasionally glancing at his children to check their emotional state. When she had finally released his shirt, leaving wrinkles in the orange fabric, he had smoothed it down with quiet dignity. His silence had been more powerful than any words, but the crowd had interpreted it as submission rather than strength. "I want them escorted to the parking lot," Eleanor had declared, her red blazer blazing under the bright lights, as she'd made her final pronouncement. "And I want their pictures circulated to security at every respectable establishment in this city. These people need to learn that actions have consequences." The walk through the club had been a gauntlet of stares and whispered comments. The marble floors had clicked under their shoes as the security guard had followed them, ensuring they actually left the premises. Wealthy patrons had lined the hallway, their phones still recording as the Rivera family had passed. The natural skylight streaming through every window had made the walk feel endless, every step illuminated for the crowd's entertainment. At the exit, Eleanor had delivered her final insult. "Don't ever try to come back here," she had called out, her voice echoing through the marble atrium. "We know who you are now, and we'll be watching." This is what happens when people try to rise above their station. James had paused at the door, his hand on Sarah's shoulder as she'd fought back tears. For just a moment, he had looked back at Eleanor Hastings, standing triumphant in her red blazer, surrounded by nodding supporters. His expression had been unreadable, but something in his eyes had suggested this wasn't over. Then he had guided his family outside, leaving Eleanor to bask in the approval of her wealthy audience. The sun had been brilliant outside, the parking lot bathed in natural daylight that seemed almost mocking after their humiliation. As they'd walked toward their car, none of the watching crowd through the club's windows had any idea who James Rivera really was. They'd seen his orange polo shirt and khaki pants and made assumptions about his worth, his status, his right to be in their exclusive space. What they hadn't seen was the Thompson Foundation logo discreetly embroidered on his shirt collar. They hadn't recognized the quiet confidence of a man who owned more than everything they were looking at. And they certainly hadn't realized that their precious charity event, Eleanor Hastings' entire reputation, and the very building they were standing in, all depended on the generosity of the man they just humiliated and ejected. The cruel irony hung in the air like the brilliant sunlight streaming through every window, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally surface and justice would transform their small, ignorant world forever. The black Mercedes-Benz sat in the country club's circular driveway like a fortress of dignity amid chaos. James Rivera adjusted his orange polo shirt and looked through the tinted windows at the building that had just expelled his family. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the manicured landscape, but inside their vehicle, The Rivera family struggled with emotions far darker than any shadow. Sarah Rivera pressed her face against the leather seat, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. At 16, she had experienced racism before, but never so publicly, never so viciously. The red sundress she had carefully chosen that morning now felt like a costume for humiliation. Her brother Marcus Rivera sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight it could crack stone. His orange button-down shirt was wrinkled from Eleanor Hastings's assault on their father, and his dark eyes burned with fury that threatened to consume him. "Baby girl, look at me," Diane Rivera whispered, turning in the passenger seat to face her daughter. Her red sundress rustled as she reached back to stroke Sarah's hair. "What happened in there says nothing about us and everything about them, but everyone was watching." "Mom," Sarah choked out between tears. "Everyone was laughing. They recorded it on their phones. What if this gets online? What if my friends see it?" Marcus Rivera's fist slammed against the car door. "Let them post it. Let the whole world see what these racist monsters are really like." "Marcus?" James Rivera's voice carried calm authority, even as his own heart raced with protective fury. "I understand your anger. I feel it too. But we're going to channel that energy into something productive." "Productive?" Marcus turned toward his father, his voice rising. "Dad, she put her hands on you. She grabbed your shirt like you were some kind of criminal. And those security guards, the way they looked at us, like we were dirt under their shoes." James Rivera's phone buzzed in his hand. He had been making calls since they reached the car, his business mind already calculating moves and countermoves. The Thompson Foundation's legal team needed to be activated. His investment firm's management team required immediate briefing. But first, his family needed healing. "Son, that woman's ignorance revealed more about her character than it ever could about ours," James Rivera said, meeting his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "But you're right to be angry. What happened was unacceptable, and it won't go unanswered." A police cruiser pulled into the driveway, its presence immediately shifting the family's attention. James Rivera recognized the tall, muscular figure emerging from the vehicle before the man even removed his sunglasses. Detective Kevin Harmon wore his long-sleeved uniform with a blue jacket, despite the warm afternoon, his badge catching the sunlight as he approached their car. James Rivera rolled down the window as Kevin Harmon reached them. The detective's weathered face showed genuine concern and barely contained anger. "James, I got a call about an incident here," Detective Kevin Harmon said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Someone reported a disturbance involving your family. Are you all right?" "We're physically unharmed, Kevin, but what happened in there was completely unacceptable," James Rivera replied, noting how his friend's jaw muscles tensed at the confirmation. Detective Kevin Harmon leaned down slightly, his muscular frame filling the window opening. "Tell me everything. Don't leave out any details." As James Rivera recounted the incident, Detective Kevin Harmon's expression grew increasingly dark. The officer's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his professional training warring with personal outrage at hearing how Eleanor Hastings had assaulted his friend and humiliated the children he had watched grow up. "That woman put her hands on you without cause," Detective Kevin Harmon said when James Rivera finished. "That's assault, plain and simple. I can arrest her right now." "Kevin, I appreciate that, truly. But we're going to handle this differently," James Rivera said, his tone suggesting deeper strategies at work. "However, I want this incident officially documented. Can you file a report?" Inside the country club, Eleanor Hastings stood in the main dining room, basking in congratulations from several wealthy patrons. Her red blazer was straightened now, her silver hair perfectly arranged as if the violent confrontation had never happened. The afternoon light streaming through the large windows illuminated her satisfied smile as she accepted praise from people whose approval she craved. "Eleanor, you handled that beautifully," said Mrs. Whitman, an elderly woman whose family had belonged to the club for 3 generations. "We simply cannot have those people thinking they belong in places like this." "Absolutely," agreed Harold Pemberton, adjusting his expensive watch. "You maintained the club's standards. That's exactly why we need strong leadership like yours." Eleanor Hastings preened under the attention, her chest swelling with vindication. I've been managing events here for 15 years. I know exactly what kind of people belong at our functions and what kind don't. That man was clearly trying to cause trouble. Linda Prescott stood nearby in her green blouse and blue jacket, clipboard clutched against her chest, as she watched the celebration with growing discomfort. As the club's general manager, she had witnessed Eleanor Hastings' behavior for years, but today's incident felt different, more violent, more public, more dangerous for everyone involved. Eleanor, perhaps we should discuss what happened, Linda Prescott ventured, her voice carefully measured. The way you grabbed that gentleman, some people might interpret that as assault. Eleanor Hastings whirled around, her face immediately hardening. Linda, I handled the situation appropriately. That man was clearly trespassing, probably planning to steal something or cause a disturbance. I protected our members and maintained our standards. But he was with his family, and they were well dressed, and he seemed genuinely surprised by your reaction. Linda Prescott pressed, though her voice grew smaller, under Eleanor Hastings' withering glare. Linda, if you can't support the decisions I make to protect this club, then perhaps you're not the right fit for management here, Eleanor Hastings snapped. I don't need second guessing from someone who clearly doesn't understand the delicate balance required to maintain our exclusivity. Linda Prescott's face flushed, but she remained silent, retreating to her office with growing unease about the entire situation. Outside in the parking lot, Detective Kevin Harmon finished taking photographs of James Rivera's wrinkled shirt and documented the family's statements. His report would create an official record of Eleanor Hastings' assault, even if charges weren't immediately filed. James, you know I respect your approach, but that woman needs consequences, Detective Kevin Harmon said, closing his notepad. I've seen too many situations like this get swept under the rug. Trust me, Kevin, consequences are coming, but they're going to be proportional and permanent, James Rivera replied, his phone already ringing with return calls from his legal team. Across the parking lot, Natalie Romero sat in her silver sedan, scrolling through the photographs she had captured during the charity luncheon. As the event's official photographer, she had been documenting the elegant gathering when Eleanor Hastings' explosion erupted. Her camera had captured the entire sequence. Eleanor Hastings grabbing James Rivera's shirt, the family's shocked faces, the crowd's cruel laughter, and the security guard's aggressive response. Natalie Romero stared at the images on her camera's display screen, her stomach churning with disgust at what she had witnessed. She had been photographing society events for 8 years, but she had never seen such blatant racism displayed so publicly. The images told a story that demanded wider audience. Her finger hovered over her phone's screen as she debated whether to post the photographs on social media. The pictures were technically her property, taken in a public space during a public event, but sharing them would certainly end her contract with the country club and likely damage her reputation among the wealthy clients who formed her primary income source. The decision crystallized when she remembered the young girl's tears and the boy's helpless anger. Some things mattered more than business contracts. Back in the Mercedes-Benz, James Rivera ended another phone call and turned to face his family fully. His expression carried the weight of decision and the promise of action. Listen to me, all of you, he said, his voice gentle but firm. What happened today was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. But we have a choice about how we respond. We can let this break us down, or we can use it to build something better. What do you mean, Dad? Sarah Rivera asked, her tears finally slowing. I mean, we're going to make sure this never happens to another family. We're going to create change that lasts longer than our anger, James Rivera explained. But I need to know that you're with me. This isn't going to be easy, and it might get uncomfortable before it gets better. Marcus Rivera straightened in his seat, the fury in his eyes transforming into determination. We're with you, Dad, whatever it takes. Diane Rivera reached across and squeezed her husband's hand. You know we stand together as a family, always. James Rivera's phone buzzed with a text message from Brian Nakamura, his attorney. Saw the news alert. On my way. Don't do anything until I get there. The notification confirmed what James Rivera had suspected. The incident was already spreading beyond the country club's manicured grounds. Social media's reach would amplify their humiliation. but it would also amplify the truth. As the Rivera family sat in their car, processing trauma and planning justice, the foundations of Eleanor Hastings's carefully constructed world began to shift beneath her feet. She remained inside the club, accepting congratulations and planning her next charity event, completely unaware that her actions had set in motion forces that would ultimately destroy everything she thought she controlled. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on the country club's pristine facade, but shadows were gathering that would soon expose the rot beneath its polished surface. The Rivera family's real power remained hidden for now, but not for much longer. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James Rivera's downtown office as he sat across from his attorney, Brian Nakamura. The lawyer's orange dress shirt caught the natural light, his blue jacket draped over the back of his chair as he spread documents across the mahogany conference table. The overhead fluorescent lights illuminated every detail of the contracts and financial records they were reviewing. "James, what happened yesterday wasn't just personal humiliation," Brian said, adjusting his glasses as he studied a legal pad filled with notes. "This appears to be part of a systematic pattern. I've already made some preliminary calls, and there are whispers about other incidents at Meadowbrook Country Club." James Rivera leaned back in his leather chair, his jaw set with determination. "I want to know everything, Brian. Every complaint, every incident, every time someone like Eleanor Hastings decided who belongs and who doesn't." Brian nodded, pulling out his tablet. "I've contacted 3 employment attorneys who've had cases involving Meadowbrook staff. 2 settled out of court with confidentiality agreements, but the 3rd attorney is willing to talk off the record. There's a pattern here of discrimination complaints being buried or dismissed." The office door opened as Diane Rivera entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She wore a professional navy blazer over a white blouse, her expression mixing anger with resolve. "The children are at school, but Sarah barely slept last night. She keeps asking why that woman treated us that way." "Because people like Eleanor Hastings have never been held accountable," James replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But that's about to change." Brian's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. "That's Detective Harmon. He said he'd call this morning with information about previous complaints filed against the club." James picked up the call on speaker. Kevin Harmon's voice filled the room, professional, but tinged with frustration. "James, I've been digging through incident reports from the past 3 years. There have been 6 formal complaints about discrimination at Meadowbrook Country Club. 5 were classified as unfounded or unable to verify, and 1 resulted in a minor fine that was quietly paid." "What kind of incidents?" Diane asked, her marketing executive instincts sensing a larger story. "Everything from minority guests being questioned about their right to be there, to staff members being passed over for promotions, to subtle but consistent patterns of different treatment. The problem is, most victims didn't have the resources or connections to push back effectively." Brian made notes as Kevin continued. "Eleanor Hastings' name appears in 3 of those reports, always as the club representative who handled the situation. In each case, the complaints mysteriously disappeared or were resolved with minimal consequences." James felt his anger building, but he channeled it into focus. "Kevin, I need you to document everything officially. No more looking the other way, because these people have money and influence." "Already on it. I'm also reaching out to former employees who might be willing to talk now that there's video evidence of what happened to your family." After ending the call, James turned to Brian. "I want to meet with Dr. Vivian Caldwell today. If Eleanor Hastings has been running that charity event, I need to know exactly where the money has been going." 2 hours later, James and Brian sat in Dr. Caldwell's modest community center office. The pediatric oncologist wore an elegant red dress that complemented her professional demeanor, but her expression was troubled. Natural light from the large windows mixed with bright overhead fluorescence as she pulled financial records from a filing cabinet. "Mr. Rivera, I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't been as diligent as I should have been about tracking the charity funds," Dr. Caldwell began, spreading papers across her desk. "Eleanor Hastings always handled the financial reporting, and she assured me everything was being managed properly." Brian leaned forward, studying the documents. "These numbers don't match what the country club reported as total donations. According to their public filings, they raised over $300,000 last year. But your charity only received $210,000. Dr. Caldwell's eyes widened. That's impossible. Eleanor Hastings told me we received the full amount minus minimal administrative costs. James felt pieces clicking into place. Brian, get our forensic accountant involved. I want every dollar traced from the donors to the final recipients. There's something else, Dr. Caldwell continued, her voice dropping. Last month, Eleanor Hastings approached me about streamlining our financial reporting. She wanted me to sign forms that would have given her discretionary authority over how funds were allocated. I declined because it felt inappropriate, but now I'm wondering what she was really trying to accomplish. Meanwhile, across town at Meadowbrook Country Club, Eleanor Hastings paced frantically in her office, her red blazer wrinkled from stress. The morning light streaming through her windows felt harsh and unforgiving as she clutched her phone, scrolling through social media posts about yesterday's incident. Linda, get in here immediately, Eleanor barked through her intercom. Linda Prescott appeared in the doorway, wearing a green blouse and blue jacket, her usual nervous energy amplified by the tension crackling through the building. Yes, Mrs. Hastings, these social media posts about yesterday need to disappear. Contact our public relations firm and have them scrub this content. I don't care what it costs. Linda shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hastings, I'm not sure we can legally force people to remove their posts, and some of the videos have already been shared thousands of times. Eleanor's face flushed red with rage. I don't want to hear about legal limitations. That Rivera man was clearly trying to create a scene for attention, and I won't let this club's reputation be damaged by his publicity stunt. But Mrs. Hastings, several board members have been calling all morning, asking questions about what happened. Gerald Sutton wants to schedule an emergency meeting. The color drained from Eleanor's face. Gerald Sutton was the most influential board member, a man whose family had belonged to Meadowbrook for 3 generations. If he was asking questions, the situation was more serious than she'd anticipated. At that moment, Gerald Sutton himself was fielding angry phone calls in his home study. The elderly board member, distinguished in his blue jacket, despite being in his own house, listened grimly as another longtime member expressed outrage about the incident. Gerald, my daughter saw the video on Instagram, the caller was saying. That family looked like perfectly respectable people. What exactly happened at our charity luncheon? Gerald rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of responsibility. He'd served on Meadowbrook's board for 15 years, always believing the club maintained high standards while treating everyone with dignity. Yesterday's incident was forcing him to question assumptions he'd never examined. I'm scheduling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, Gerald replied. We need to understand exactly what occurred and ensure it never happens again. After ending the call, Gerald sat quietly in his study, natural light from the garden windows illuminating family photos that included decades of memories at Meadowbrook. He'd watched the club evolve over the years, but perhaps not quickly enough. The thought troubled him deeply. Back at the community center, James Rivera was wrapping up his meeting with Dr. Caldwell when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Rivera, this is Stephanie Lawson from Channel 7 News. I'm investigating the incident at Meadowbrook Country Club yesterday, and I'd like to request an interview. James glanced at Brian, who nodded encouragingly. Miss Lawson, I'm willing to speak with you, but I want to make sure this story is about more than just what happened to my family. This is about systemic discrimination that affects many people. That's exactly the angle I'm pursuing, Stephanie replied. My research suggests your experience may be part of a larger pattern. I'd also like to investigate how charity funds are being managed at these exclusive events. As James scheduled the interview, Brian received a text message that made him smile grimly. Our forensic accountant just finished his preliminary analysis of the charity's financial records. Eleanor Hastings has some serious explaining to do. Across town, Pastor Henderson was organizing a different kind of response. The respected community leader had spent the morning on the phone with other ministers, civil rights organizations, and community groups. Word about the Rivera family's treatment was spreading through networks that Eleanor Hastings never knew existed. "This isn't just about one family," Pastor Henderson told his assistant as they planned an afternoon meeting. "This is about every family that's ever been made to feel unwelcome in spaces they have every right to occupy." The pastor's phone had been ringing constantly since videos of the incident began circulating. Community members who had experienced similar treatment at various establishments were finally finding their voices, inspired by James Rivera's dignity under pressure. As the afternoon progressed, the investigation was gaining momentum from multiple directions. Brian Nakamura's legal team was building a comprehensive case file. Detective Harmon was documenting official complaints, and community leaders were mobilizing support networks that Eleanor Hastings never anticipated. At Meadowbrook Country Club, Linda Prescott was fielding increasingly difficult questions from concerned members, while Eleanor Hastings remained barricaded in her office, desperately trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond her influence. The truth was emerging methodically, like sunlight burning through morning fog. Each piece of evidence, every witness testimony, and all the financial discrepancies were creating a narrative much larger than yesterday's humiliation. James Rivera's systematic approach was revealing not just Eleanor Hastings's personal prejudices, but an entire structure that had enabled and protected discrimination for years. As evening approached, James Rivera sat in his home office, reviewing the day's findings with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The investigation was proceeding exactly as planned, but the scope of the problems they'd uncovered was more extensive than he'd imagined. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and Eleanor Hastings' world was about to become much more complicated. The methodical pursuit of truth was building unstoppable momentum, and the community support growing around his family proved that dignity and justice could triumph over prejudice and power. The investigation phase was nearly complete, and James Rivera was ready for the next stage of holding people accountable for their choices. The afternoon sun blazed through the massive skylights of Willowbrook Country Club's boardroom, casting harsh shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. Natural light flooded every corner of the ornate space, illuminating the tension that crackled between the 12 board members seated in leather chairs. Gerald Sutton, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder, sat at the head of the table in his crisp blue jacket, his elderly frame rigid with barely contained anger. Eleanor Hastings occupied her usual seat to his right, her red blazer immaculate, despite the storm brewing around her. She maintained her haughty composure, occasionally smoothing her perfectly styled blonde hair, as if the emergency board meeting was merely an inconvenience. Her manicured fingers drummed impatiently on the table's surface, each tap echoing through the silent room like a countdown to disaster. Linda Prescott stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her green blouse and blue jacket catching the afternoon light as she clutched a thick stack of documents to her chest. Her nervous energy filled the room as she shifted from foot to foot, waiting for her moment to speak. The club manager's face showed the strain of sleepless nights since the charity luncheon incident, her usual professional calm replaced by anxious determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald Sutton began, his voice carrying the authority of his 73 years and 3 decades on the club's board. "We're here to address the incident that occurred at Saturday's charity luncheon, an incident that has brought unwanted attention to our institution and potentially exposed us to serious legal liability." Eleanor Hastings leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "Gerald, I've already explained my actions. That man and his family clearly didn't belong at our event. I was protecting the integrity of our membership and the safety of our guests." Board member Patricia Wells, a silver-haired woman in an orange top and blue jacket, shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, the videos circulating on social media show you physically grabbing the gentleman. The optics are terrible." "The optics?" Eleanor's voice rose sharply. "What about the optics of allowing random people to crash our private events? We have standards to maintain, and I won't apologize for upholding them." Gerald Sutton's jaw tightened as he opened his folder. "That's exactly what we need to discuss. Your methods and the consequences they've brought upon this club. Linda, please share what you've discovered about the charity event's funding." Linda Prescott approached the table with trembling hands, her documents rustling as she set them down. The overhead fluorescent lights revealed the perspiration on her brow, despite the room's air conditioning. "Board members, I've been reviewing the charitable donation records for Saturday's luncheon, and there's something critical you all need to know." Eleanor Hastings waved dismissively. "Linda, whatever paperwork concerns you have can wait. We need to focus on preventing future security breaches." "This can't wait," Linda replied, finding strength in her voice. "The Thompson Foundation was our primary sponsor for the charity luncheon. They provided the majority of funding for the entire event." The room fell into absolute silence. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of golfers on the course outside. Board members exchanged worried glances as the implications began to sink in. Richard Calloway, a middle-aged investment banker in his green shirt and blue jacket, leaned forward. "How much did the Thompson Foundation contribute?" Linda consulted her papers, her hands still shaking. $2 million. They funded the catering, decorations, entertainment, and provided the charitable donations that were distributed to the beneficiaries. Eleanor Hastings felt a cold prick of unease, but maintained her defiant stance. "So what if some foundation donated money? That doesn't change the fact that uninvited guests disrupted our event. The donor probably hired that family to crash the party for publicity." Gerald Sutton studied Eleanor's face with growing concern. "Eleanor, do you know who James Rivera is?" "Some opportunist looking for attention and a quick settlement," Eleanor snapped. "I've dealt with these types before. They crash exclusive events, wait for someone to confront them, then claim discrimination. It's a common scam." Linda Prescott cleared her throat, gathering courage for what came next. "Eleanor, James Rivera is the founder and president of the Thompson Foundation. The man you had removed from the premises was our biggest donor." The color drained from Eleanor Hastings' face as if someone had opened a valve. Her confident posture crumbled, shoulders sagging as the weight of her mistake began to register. The room seemed to spin around her as she processed the devastating revelation. "That's impossible," she whispered, then louder. "That's absolutely impossible. He was wearing casual clothes. His children were running around. Real philanthropists don't behave that way at formal events." Patricia Wells covered her face with her hands. "Oh my God, Eleanor, what have you done to us?" Just then, the boardroom doors opened with a soft click that seemed to thunder through the tense silence. Brian Nakamura entered, his muscular frame imposing in his orange shirt and blue jacket. The family attorney carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confident stride of someone holding all the winning cards. Gerald Sutton rose from his seat. "Mr. Nakamura, thank you for coming, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Brian nodded respectfully, setting his briefcase on the conference table. The overhead lights reflected off his polished shoes as he positioned himself where everyone could see him clearly. "Gentlemen, ladies, I represent James Rivera and the Rivera family. I'm here to discuss Saturday's incident and its implications for your club." Eleanor Hastings found her voice again, though it cracked with strain. "This is highly irregular. Board meetings are private affairs." "Mrs. Hastings," Brian replied calmly, "after what you did to my client and his family, privacy is a luxury you no longer enjoy." Gerald Sutton gestured to an empty chair. "Please, Mr. Nakamura, help us understand the situation." Brian opened his briefcase and withdrew several official-looking documents. "First, let me confirm what Ms. Prescott has shared. James Rivera is indeed the founder and president of the Thompson Foundation. These incorporation papers and tax documents verify his position." He spread the papers across the table, where the natural skylight illuminated every official seal and signature. Board members leaned forward to examine the documents, their faces growing increasingly pale as they recognized the legal authenticity. "The Thompson Foundation has been supporting various charitable causes in this community for over 15 years, Brian continued. "Mr. Rivera's personal net worth exceeds $50 million, and his foundation has donated over $20 million to local charities during that time." Eleanor Hastings felt her world tilting off its axis. This has to be some elaborate fraud. Rich people don't dress like that at charity events. They don't let their children run around freely. "Mrs. Hastings, Brian's voice carried a sharp edge. Your ignorance about how actual wealthy people behave doesn't justify assault and discrimination. My client wore appropriate attire for a daytime charity luncheon, and his children were well behaved throughout the event until you traumatized them. Richard Calloway studied the financial documents with his banker's eye. These numbers are legitimate. The foundation's assets and donation history are all documented here. Gerald Sutton sank back into his chair, his elderly frame seeming to age another decade in mere minutes. Eleanor, do you understand what you've done? You publicly humiliated and physically assaulted one of our community's most generous philanthropists. Eleanor's red blazer seemed to burn brighter under the fluorescent lights as desperation crept into her voice. I was protecting the club. How was I supposed to know? He should have identified himself properly. He was invited, Linda Prescott interjected. The Thompson Foundation received a formal invitation as our primary sponsor. Mr. Rivera had every right to be there with his family. Brian Nakamura withdrew another document from his briefcase. This brings us to the legal implications. My client has grounds for assault charges, discrimination claims, and defamation lawsuits. The video evidence clearly shows Mrs. Hastings grabbing my client without provocation. Patricia Wells turned to Eleanor with horror. You told us he became aggressive first. You said he threatened you. The videos show otherwise, Brian replied. Multiple witnesses recorded the entire incident. My client maintained his dignity while being publicly humiliated and physically assaulted by your employee. Eleanor Hastings felt the walls closing in around her. The boardroom that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a courtroom where she stood trial. Gerald, you can't let them destroy everything we've built here. This club has standards, traditions, standards that apparently include attacking our biggest donors, Gerald replied bitterly. Eleanor, I'm asking for your immediate resignation. Absolutely not. Eleanor shot to her feet, her chair rolling backward. I refuse to be sacrificed for doing my job. That man is probably lying about his wealth to extort money from us. Brian Nakamura smiled coldly. Mrs. Hastings, would you like me to call Mr. Rivera's bank president? Or perhaps his investment firm partners? We can verify his financial status in real time. The other board members began pulling out their phones, frantically typing messages and making calls. The room filled with urgent whispers as they reached out to contacts in the financial community. I'm calling Davidson Trust, Richard announced. They handle major philanthropic accounts. Patricia Wells was already on her phone. My husband knows someone at Rivera Capital Management. Eleanor watched in growing horror as the board members scrambled to verify information she desperately hoped would prove false. The natural skylight above cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the lines of stress that had appeared in the past few minutes. Gerald Sutton stood slowly, his blue jacket rumpled from the stress of the meeting. Eleanor, while we wait for confirmation, I strongly advise you to consider your position. If these allegations prove true, your actions have put this entire institution at risk. I won't resign, Eleanor declared, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. If James Rivera is really wealthy, then he can afford to be forgiving. Rich people understand that mistakes happen. Brian Nakamura closed his briefcase with a decisive click. Mrs. Hastings, my client's wealth doesn't obligation him to tolerate racism and assault. If anything, it gives him more resources to seek justice. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as board members continued their frantic phone calls. Eleanor Hastings remained standing, isolated at the head of the table like a general whose army was abandoning her on the battlefield. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the skylights, but the warmth seemed to avoid her entirely. As the chapter ended, the boardroom buzzed with nervous energy and desperate conversations. Eleanor Hastings had learned the first devastating truth about her victim. But the board members' investigations were about to uncover revelations that would shake the very foundations of Willowbrook Country Club. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 in the morning, and the Ashford Country Club's executive conference room had never felt more tense. Natural skylight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the mahogany table where 7 board members sat in uncomfortable silence. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their worried faces as they waited for Gerald Sutton to begin what would become the most devastating meeting in the club's 100-year history. Gerald Sutton, his elderly frame wrapped in his customary blue jacket, sat at the head of the table with a thick manila folder before him. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his reading glasses, the weight of what he was about to reveal making his 78 years feel like a century. The investigation they had commissioned overnight had yielded results that would change everything they thought they knew about their prestigious institution, and the man Eleanor Hastings had so publicly humiliated just days before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald began, his voice carrying the gravity of impending disaster. "What I'm about to share with you will fundamentally alter our understanding of yesterday's events and our club's future." He opened the folder, revealing financial documents that had been rushed over by their accounting firm's emergency team. The investigation into James Rivera has uncovered information that makes Eleanor's actions not just morally reprehensible, but financially catastrophic. Linda Prescott sat 3 seats down from Gerald, her green blouse and blue jacket impeccable despite having worked through the night to gather information. She had been dreading this moment since she first realized who James Rivera might actually be, and now her worst fears were about to be confirmed in front of the entire board. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension, as she watched Gerald prepare to drop the first bombshell. "Our first revelation," Gerald continued, his voice growing stronger as he read from the documents, "concerns the ownership structure of this very building we're sitting in." He held up a legal document that looked official and intimidating under the bright conference room lighting. "Divorce Capital Management, James Rivera's investment firm, holds the primary mortgage on the entire Ashford Country Club property. Not a portion of it, not a stake in it, the entire property." The silence that followed was deafening. Board member Patricia Walsh, elegant in her red blazer, felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her like a physical blow. The man Eleanor Hastings had grabbed by his orange polo shirt and thrown out of their charity luncheon essentially owned the building they were sitting in. The irony was so devastating it felt surreal. "That's impossible," stammered Robert Chen, the club's treasurer, his orange shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night spent reviewing financial records. "We would have known. The mortgage holder has to be disclosed in our annual reports." Gerald nodded grimly. "Rivera Capital Management operates through a complex network of subsidiary companies. The mortgage appears under the name RCM Holdings, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Rivera Capital Management. James Rivera has been our primary creditor for the past 3 years, ever since he bought the debt from First National Bank when they were restructuring their commercial loan portfolio." Linda Prescott finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "There's more," she said, knowing that her revelation would make the situation even worse. "I've been trying to track down our anonymous donor programs, the ones that have been funding our facility improvements and member scholarship program." She stood up, her legs unsteady, and moved to the window where she could look out at the golf course that James Rivera effectively owned. James Rivera has been funding those programs for years. The new tennis courts, the clubhouse renovations, the scholarships that have helped dozens of young members afford their fees. All of it came from the Thompson Foundation, which is James Rivera's charitable organization. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and half-whispered curses. Board members began frantically shuffling through their copies of the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. The man Eleanor Hastings had publicly humiliated and ejected from their property had been quietly supporting their club and its members for years, asking for nothing in return and seeking no recognition for his generosity. "How much money are we talking about?" asked Patricia Walsh, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. Linda returned to her seat, pulling out her own folder of financial records. Over the past 5 years, the Thompson Foundation has donated approximately $400,000 to various club programs and facilities. The scholarship program alone has received over $100,000, all designated as anonymous donations per James Rivera's specific instructions. Gerald Sutton felt sick to his stomach as he continued reading from the investigation report. The charity luncheon that started this entire disaster was funded by a $2 million donation from the Thompson Foundation. James Rivera personally wrote the check that paid for every flower arrangement, every piece of silverware, every bite of food that was served while Eleanor was screaming at him that he didn't belong there. The devastating irony hit every person in that room like a sledgehammer. They had all witnessed Eleanor Hastings humiliate the very man whose generosity had made their elegant lifestyle possible. The charity event where he was ejected had been funded entirely by his own money, and he had attended as both the primary donor and an invited guest, only to be treated like a criminal trespasser. Before anyone could fully process these revelations, Detective Kevin Harmon's muscular frame appeared in the conference room doorway. His long-sleeved police uniform was perfectly pressed, and his expression was grimly professional as he surveyed the assembled board members. The natural daylight streaming through the windows caught the badge on his chest, making it gleam with authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Mr. Sutton, members of the board," Detective Harmon said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "I apologize for interrupting your meeting, but I have information that directly relates to your current discussions about Eleanor Hastings and the events of yesterday." Gerald gestured for the detective to continue, sensing that whatever news he brought would only make their situation worse. Detective Harmon stepped fully into the room, his imposing presence filling the space with the weight of legal authority and impending consequences. "Our investigation into Eleanor Hastings has uncovered evidence of financial irregularities dating back 18 months, Detective Harmon announced, pulling out his own folder of documents. "We have documentation showing that she has been systematically embezzling funds from charity events, donor contributions, and club operational accounts. The total amount appears to exceed $75,000. Patricia Walsh felt faint as the full scope of Eleanor's crimes became clear. Not only had she committed public assault and discrimination against James Rivera, but she had been stealing from the very charitable causes she claimed to support. The woman who had appointed herself the guardian of the club's standards had been nothing more than a common thief hiding behind a veneer of respectability. The pattern is consistent and deliberate," Detective Harmon continued, his muscular frame radiating the confidence of a man presenting an airtight case. "Eleanor Hastings would inflate event costs, create fake vendor invoices, and skim donations intended for charitable organizations. Dr. Vivian Caldwell's medical clinic, which was supposed to benefit from yesterday's luncheon, has been systematically cheated out of thousands of dollars over the past year." Linda Prescott stood up again, her green blouse and blue jacket making her look professional despite the chaos unfolding around them. "I can confirm Detective Harmon's findings," she said, her voice stronger now that the truth was finally emerging. "I've been suspicious of Eleanor's financial management for months, but she always had explanations that seemed plausible. Now I realize she was systematically defrauding both the club and the charities we were supposed to be supporting." The weight of their collective realization settled over the board like a suffocating blanket. Eleanor Hastings, the woman they had trusted to maintain their club's reputation and standards, had been destroying both through her racism and her theft. She had humiliated and assaulted their most generous benefactor, while simultaneously stealing from the charitable causes he supported. Gerald Sutton's hands shook more violently as he reached for his phone. "We need to terminate Eleanor Hastings immediately," he said, his elderly voice cracking with emotion. "Her employment with this club ends today. Linda, I want you to draft the termination letter and have it ready within the hour." But even as the board began discussing Eleanor's immediate dismissal, Detective Harmon held up his hand to indicate he had more to share. The overhead fluorescent lights cast stark shadows across his muscular features as he prepared to deliver another devastating piece of information. "There's something else you need to know," Detective Harmon said, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "We've been in contact with Stephanie Lawson from Channel 7 News. She's been investigating discrimination complaints at exclusive venues throughout the city, and the incident with James Rivera has become the centerpiece of her story." As if summoned by the mention of her name, the conference room's television screen flickered to life as someone found the remote control. Stephanie Lawson's professional image filled the screen, her red blazer bright against the backdrop of the country club's entrance where she was conducting live interviews with community members and charity beneficiaries. "Good morning. This is Stephanie Lawson reporting on a developing story that has rocked the exclusive Ashford Country Club." Her voice filled the conference room as board members watched in horrified fascination. Yesterday's charity luncheon, intended to raise funds for local medical clinics, instead became the scene of a shocking racist incident that has exposed a web of discrimination and financial misconduct. The camera cut to Dr. Vivian Caldwell, elegant and dignified in her red dress, standing outside the medical clinic that served underprivileged communities throughout the city. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke about the impact of James Rivera's generosity and Eleanor Hastings' crimes. James Rivera and the Thompson Foundation have been the backbone of our community outreach programs for years, Dr. Caldwell explained to the camera, her words hitting the watching board members like physical blows. While Eleanor Hastings was stealing from our charity accounts, Mr. Rivera was quietly ensuring that our clinics could continue serving families who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. Patricia Walsh felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full scope of their moral failure. They had allowed a racist thief to represent their club while driving away the very man whose generosity had been keeping their community programs alive. The shame was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that their failure was now being broadcast to the entire city. The news segment continued with interviews from other community leaders, all praising James Rivera's quiet philanthropy and condemning Eleanor Hastings' actions. Pastor Henderson appeared on screen, his dignified presence commanding respect as he spoke about the Rivera family's contributions to youth programs and community development initiatives. Detective Harmon turned off the television and faced the board with grim determination. Eleanor Hastings will be formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and assault within the next 24 hours, he announced, his muscular frame radiating the authority of impending justice. The evidence against her is overwhelming, and the district attorney's office is treating this as a high-priority case, given the public attention and the clear pattern of criminal behavior. Gerald Sutton stood up slowly, his elderly frame bearing the weight of leadership in the club's darkest hour. Detective Harmon, please know that this board will cooperate fully with your investigation. We want justice for James Rivera, for Dr. Caldwell's clinic, and for every charity that Eleanor Hastings defrauded while claiming to represent our values. But even as Gerald spoke, the conference room door burst open, and Eleanor Hastings herself stormed in, her red blazer wrinkled and her face flushed with desperate anger. She had clearly heard rumors about the board meeting and had come to defend herself, but her timing could not have been worse. Walking into a room full of evidence of her crimes while a police detective was present was perhaps the most self-destructive decision she could have made. "What is the meaning of this secret meeting?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shrill with panic as she noticed Detective Harmon's imposing presence. "You can't make decisions about my employment without giving me the opportunity to defend myself." The silence that greeted her outburst was deafening. Every person in that sunlit conference room stared at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, knowing that she had just walked into the complete exposure of her crimes and racism. The natural daylight streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate every line of guilt and desperation on her face. Gerald Sutton's voice was steady and final as he delivered the crushing blow. "Eleanor Hastings, by unanimous vote of this board, your employment with the Ashford Country Club is hereby terminated, effective immediately. You are no longer welcome on this property, and any attempt to enter these premises will be considered trespassing." Eleanor's face went white as she realized her world was collapsing around her. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, her composure completely shattered. "I've given 15 years of my life to this club. I've maintained standards and protected our reputation. I'll sue every one of you for wrongful termination and discrimination." Detective Harmon stepped forward, his muscular frame and long-sleeved uniform commanding immediate attention. "Miss Hastings, I strongly advise you to contact an attorney immediately. You're going to need legal representation for the criminal charges that will be filed against you." As the reality of her situation finally penetrated Eleanor's panicked mind, she began to understand that her crimes had been discovered and her racist assault on James Rivera had triggered an investigation that revealed everything. The woman who had spent years stealing from charities while claiming moral authority was about to face the full consequences of her actions. Linda Prescott watched Eleanor's breakdown with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. For years, she had watched Eleanor's toxic behavior poison the club's atmosphere while being unable to challenge her authority. Now finally, the truth was emerging and justice was beginning to unfold. The meeting concluded with Eleanor Hastings being escorted from the property, by Detective Harmon, while Brian Nakamura, James Rivera's attorney, arrived to begin the legal processes that would ensure full accountability. The sun continued to shine brightly through the conference room windows, illuminating a club that was finally ready to confront its failures and begin the difficult work of redemption. As the board members filed out of the conference room, each carrying copies of the devastating evidence that had emerged, they knew that their club would never be the same. The man they had allowed to be humiliated and ejected was preparing for a final confrontation that would complete Eleanor Hastings's downfall and transform their institution forever. The truth had finally emerged, and there would be no escaping the consequences of their collective moral failure. James Rivera's quiet dignity was about to be vindicated in the most public and complete way possible, while Eleanor Hastings faced the total destruction of everything she had built through her racism and theft. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as James Rivera stepped out of his Mercedes onto the country club's circular driveway, the same entrance where he'd been humiliated just days before. This time, however, everything was different. Gone was the uncertain posture of a man caught off guard by hatred. In its place stood a confident businessman wearing a crisp green polo shirt and dark slacks, his shoulders squared with purpose. The natural skylight streaming through the club's grand windows seemed to spotlight his arrival as he walked toward the main entrance with measured, deliberate steps. Word of his return had spread quickly through the club's gossip network. Members gathered on the terrace overlooking the entrance, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of anticipation. Some watched from behind curtains in the main dining room, while others positioned themselves strategically in the lobby. Everyone knew this moment would define the future of their exclusive sanctuary. Eleanor Hastings stood near the terrace railing, her red blazer wrinkled, and her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. The past few days had been a nightmare of board meetings, legal threats, and mounting evidence of her misconduct. Her hands trembled as she gripped her coffee cup, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. She'd spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to salvage her position, but deep down, she knew the truth had finally caught up with her. Linda Prescott emerged from the administrative offices, wearing a bright orange blouse and navy skirt, her arms full of documents. For years, she'd watched Eleanor Hastings' toxic behavior from the sidelines, too intimidated to speak up. But now, with the truth finally exposed, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She positioned herself near the terrace entrance, ready to witness what she knew would be Eleanor Hastings' final moments of power. Gerald Sutton, distinguished in his blue jacket and gray trousers, stood with several other board members near the main staircase. His elderly face bore the weight of guilt and responsibility. As someone who'd served on the club's board for over 2 decades, he felt personally responsible for allowing Eleanor Hastings' discrimination to flourish unchecked. Today would be his chance to make things right. James Rivera entered the main lobby, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The overhead fluorescent lighting illuminated his confident expression as he surveyed the assembled crowd. He could feel dozens of eyes watching his every move, the same eyes that had watched him being humiliated and ejected just days before. The irony wasn't lost on him that many of these same people had laughed at his family's pain. "Mr. Rivera," Gerald Sutton approached first, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to know that the board has taken decisive action regarding recent events." James Rivera nodded politely, but continued walking toward the terrace, where Eleanor Hastings waited. He had no intention of making this easy for anyone. Justice demanded that this confrontation happen in the same location where the initial crime had occurred. Eleanor Hastings straightened her blazer and attempted to compose herself as James Rivera approached. The terrace was bathed in bright afternoon sunlight, providing perfect visibility for the dozens of spectators gathering at a respectful distance. She cleared her throat and stepped forward, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Rivera, I'm so glad you're here. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, and I want to personally apologize for any confusion that may have occurred during our charity event." James Rivera stopped directly in front of her, his green polo shirt contrasting sharply with her wrinkled red blazer. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. "Confusion, Miss Hastings? Is that what you're calling it? Well, you see, in all the excitement of the event, with so many people attending, sometimes mistakes happen. Security can be overzealous, and I certainly never intended for you or your family to feel unwelcome. James Rivera reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder. Let's talk about intentions, shall we? He opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. These are pictures from your charity luncheon, taken by professional photographer Natalie Romero. In this one, you can clearly see yourself grabbing my shirt and announcing that I don't belong here. Eleanor Hastings' face paled as she stared at the photographic evidence. The image captured her racist outburst in perfect detail, her face contorted with hatred as she physically assaulted James Rivera. Around them, club members leaned forward to get a better view of the photos being displayed. And this one, James Rivera continued, producing another photograph, shows you instructing security to remove my children from the premises. My teenage children, Ms. Hastings, who were guilty of nothing more than accompanying their father to a charity event. I was just trying to maintain order, Eleanor Hastings stammered, her voice growing more desperate. Sometimes these events can get chaotic, and we have protocols to follow. James Rivera smiled coldly. Protocols. Interesting choice of words. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. Linda Prescott was kind enough to provide me with your internal communications regarding the event. Would you like me to read aloud what you wrote about my family's attendance? Linda Prescott stepped closer, her orange blouse bright in the afternoon sun. For the first time in years, she felt empowered to speak truth to power. Go ahead, Mr. Rivera. Let everyone hear what she really thinks about diversity at this club. Eleanor Hastings shot Linda Prescott a venomous look, but her subordinate no longer cowered under her gaze. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone present could feel it. These people don't understand our standards, James Rivera read from the documents. We can't let just anyone think they belong here, regardless of how much money they claim to have. Some people need to know their place. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Even the club members who'd initially supported Eleanor Hastings' actions now looked uncomfortable. The naked racism in her written words was undeniable, but that's taken out of context. Eleanor Hastings protested weakly. I was referring to dress code violations and proper event etiquette. James Rivera pulled out another set of documents. Then perhaps you can explain these financial records, showing systematic embezzlement from charity events over the past 3 years. Dr. Vivian Caldwell's organization was supposed to receive 100% of donations, but somehow 40% disappeared into administrative fees that went directly to your personal accounts. Eleanor Hastings' legs nearly gave out beneath her. She grabbed the terrace railing for support, her knuckles white with tension. Those are complex accounting procedures that you couldn't possibly understand. You're right, James Rivera agreed. That's why I had my forensic accounting team review them. The same team that handles billion-dollar acquisitions for my investment firm. They found your embezzlement pattern quite elementary, actually. The crowd murmured with shock and disgust. Stealing from charity crossed a line that even the most privileged club members couldn't ignore. Eleanor Hastings had gone from being their protector of social order to being a common thief who dragged their institution's reputation through the mud. Detective Kevin Harmon appeared at the terrace entrance, his muscular frame filling out his long-sleeved uniform perfectly. His presence immediately commanded respect from everyone present. He'd been coordinating with James Rivera's legal team and had timed his arrival perfectly for maximum impact. Eleanor Hastings, Detective Harmon announced in his authoritative voice, "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and violation of civil rights statutes. You have the right to remain silent." Eleanor Hastings spun around in panic, her red blazer now completely disheveled. "This is ridiculous. You can't arrest me based on accusations from someone who doesn't even belong here." The irony of her words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even now, facing arrest and public humiliation, she couldn't abandon the racism that had defined her worldview. James Rivera stepped closer, his voice carrying across the silent terrace. "Ms. Hastings, let me help you understand exactly who belongs here. My investment firm holds the mortgage on this entire property. My foundation has been the primary donor for your charity events. My anonymous contributions have funded club improvements and member scholarships for years." Eleanor Hastings's mouth fell open as the full weight of her mistake crashed down on her. She'd humiliated and assaulted the man who essentially owned the building where she worked. But more importantly, James Rivera continued, every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their bank account or skin color. You violated that basic principle of human decency, and now you're facing the consequences. Detective Harmon stepped forward with handcuffs, his professional demeanor unwavering. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Wait, Eleanor Hastings cried out desperately. We can work this out. I'll make amends. I'll donate to your charities. James Rivera shook his head. Justice isn't for sale, Miss Hastings. You had countless opportunities to choose compassion over cruelty, and you chose cruelty every time. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the terrace as Detective Harmon secured Eleanor Hastings' wrists behind her back. The woman who'd wielded absolute power just days before now stood completely powerless, her authority stripped away by her own actions. Diane Rivera appeared at the terrace entrance with Marcus Rivera and Sarah Rivera, all three wearing expressions of quiet satisfaction. They'd come to witness this moment of accountability, not out of vengeance, but out of a need for closure and healing. Gerald Sutton approached James Rivera with tears in his elderly eyes. Mr. Rivera, on behalf of the entire board and membership, I offer our most sincere apologies for this terrible injustice. We failed in our duty to maintain a welcoming and respectful environment. James Rivera accepted the apology with grace. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that no other family has to experience what mine did. As Detective Harmon escorted Eleanor Hastings through the crowd toward the exit, the assembled club members watched in stunned silence. Many of them recognized the poetic justice of the moment. The same path where James Rivera had been forced to walk in humiliation now carried his tormentor toward her own reckoning. Eleanor Hastings' final view of the country club was through the back window of a police car. Her red blazer, a stark reminder of the hatred that had consumed her. The institution she'd claimed to protect had ultimately rejected her completely. James Rivera stood on the terrace, surrounded by his family, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the marble floor. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the foundation had been laid for genuine transformation. The real work of healing and change was just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long rectangles of golden light across the polished marble floors. Judge Sandra Bellamy, wearing her black robes over a crisp white blouse, entered the courtroom with the measured dignity that had defined her 20-year career on the bench. Her friendship with the Rivera family went back decades, but today she would preside over Eleanor Hastings' case with the impartiality that justice demanded. Eleanor Hastings sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, her previously immaculate appearance now haggard and defeated. Gone was the red blazer and imperious confidence that had defined her reign at the country club. Her court-appointed attorney, a young man in a wrinkled green shirt and blue jacket, shuffled through papers with the resigned expression of someone fighting an unwinnable battle. Brian Nakamura stood at the prosecutor's table, his orange dress shirt and navy blue suit jacket impeccably tailored. He arranged his files with methodical precision, each document representing another nail in Eleanor Hastings's legal coffin. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing systematic embezzlement, recorded statements documenting discriminatory practices, and witness testimonies painting a picture of abuse of power that stretched back years. The state versus Eleanor Marie Hastings, Judge Bellamy announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. The defendant faces charges of embezzlement, fraud, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to commit theft. As Brian Nakamura began his opening statement, the courtroom filled with spectators. Detective Kevin Harmon sat in the front row, his muscular frame evident beneath his long-sleeved dress uniform and blue jacket. His investigation had uncovered the financial crimes that would send Eleanor Hastings to prison. But more importantly, it had exposed systematic failures in how discrimination complaints were handled throughout the city. The evidence presentation was methodical and devastating. Bank records showed Eleanor Hastings had diverted over $400,000 from charity events over 5 years, money meant for children's hospitals, homeless shelters, and educational programs. Each stolen dollar represented hope denied to vulnerable communities, and Judge Bellamy's expression grew more severe with each revelation. Eleanor Hastings' defense attorney attempted to paint his client as a scapegoat, claiming she was following orders from higher authorities. But Brian Nakamura systematically demolished these claims, presenting recorded conversations where Eleanor Hastings bragged about keeping undesirables out of the club and her ability to skim money without detection. "Your Honor," Brian Nakamura said, approaching the bench with a thick file, "the defendant's pattern of discrimination wasn't aberrant behavior. It was systematic, intentional, and designed to maintain illegal exclusionary practices while personally profiting from charitable donations meant for the very communities she sought to exclude." Meanwhile, across town at the Riverside Country Club, transformation was already underway. Linda Prescott, now the club's new director of operations, stood in the sun-drenched conference room, wearing a professional green blouse and navy blue jacket. Before her sat the club's board of directors, staff members, and community representatives as she outlined sweeping reforms. Effective immediately, Linda announced, the club will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff and board members. We're establishing a community outreach committee with rotating leadership that includes members from underrepresented groups. Gerald Sutton, the elderly board member who had initially enabled Eleanor Hastings' behavior, now led the reform efforts with genuine commitment. His blue jacket hung loosely on his aging frame, but his voice carried newfound moral authority. "We failed our community and our values," he said, addressing the gathering. "These changes aren't just policy updates. They're our commitment to ensuring this never happens again." The club's physical transformation was equally dramatic. Signs in multiple languages now welcomed visitors. The staff, previously all white, now reflected the community's diversity. The charity event space, where James Rivera had been humiliated, was renamed the Community Unity Hall, and its walls displayed artwork from local minority artists. Stephanie Lawson's investigative reporting had sparked a citywide reckoning. Her articles exposed similar discriminatory practices at 17 other exclusive venues, from private golf clubs to high-end restaurants. The mayor announced a task force to review business licenses and investigate complaints that had previously been ignored. At the downtown courthouse, the trial entered its second day with victim impact statements. Dr. Vivian Caldwell, wearing a striking red dress that commanded attention, addressed the court with quiet dignity. Eleanor Hastings didn't just steal money, Dr. Caldwell testified. She stolen hope from families who needed medical care, educational opportunities, and basic human services. Her discrimination compounded that theft by attacking the very people the charities were meant to serve. The courtroom was silent as Dr. Caldwell described how the missing funds had forced her charity to turn away dozens of families seeking help. Children had gone without medical treatment, families had remained homeless longer, and educational programs had been canceled because Eleanor Hastings viewed charity money as her personal slush fund. James Rivera attended every day of the trial, not out of vindictiveness, but as a witness to justice. He sat in the gallery, wearing a dignified orange polo shirt and dark slacks, often accompanied by Diane Rivera in her red blouse and their children, Marcus Rivera and Sarah Rivera, both missing school to understand how the legal system addressed injustice, took careful notes, and asked thoughtful questions. The defense's case crumbled under cross-examination. Eleanor Hastings took the stand in a desperate attempt to generate sympathy, claiming her actions were misunderstood and her words taken out of context. But Brian Nakamura's questioning was surgical, playing recorded conversations where Eleanor Hastings clearly expressed racist views and detailed her embezzlement schemes. "Miss Hastings," Brian Nakamura asked, "when you grabbed my client's shirt and announced he didn't belong at the charity luncheon, were those words taken out of context?" Eleanor Hastings' face reddened as she struggled to answer. "I was just trying to maintain club standards," she mumbled. "And when you called him a troublemaker and ordered security to remove him, were you maintaining standards or enforcing racial discrimination?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of everything Eleanor Hastings represented. Her stammered response only reinforced the prosecution's case. Outside the courthouse, the community's transformation continued expanding. Pastor Henderson organized interfaith dialogues about racism and social justice. Local businesses reviewed their hiring practices and customer service policies. The university established a civil rights scholarship program funded by the Rivera Foundation. Marcus Rivera and Sarah Rivera became powerful voices for change in their own right. They spoke at school assemblies, sharing their experience and encouraging other young people to stand up against discrimination. Marcus, wearing his school's orange and blue colors, addressed a packed auditorium at Lincoln High School. "What happened to our family could happen to anyone," he said, his teenage voice carrying surprising authority. "But staying silent makes you complicit. When you see injustice, you have a choice: be a bystander or be a bridge to something better." Sarah Rivera, aspiring to follow Judge Bellamy's path into law, spoke with equal passion about systemic change. "Individual racist acts are symptoms," she told her audience. "We have to change the systems that allow racism to flourish." The legal proceedings concluded with Judge Bellamy's sentencing. Eleanor Hastings stood as the judge reviewed the case, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the red blazer she'd worn during her reign of discrimination. "Miss Hastings," Judge Bellamy said, her voice carrying decades of judicial experience, "your actions represented a betrayal of trust on multiple levels. You stole from charities serving our most vulnerable citizens. You enforced illegal discriminatory practices. You abused a position of authority to harm people based on their race." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Bellamy continued. "The court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution to the affected charities, plus damages. You are permanently barred from serving in any fiduciary capacity." Eleanor Hastings collapsed into her chair, the full weight of consequences finally crushing her defiant spirit. Her former life of privilege and power was completely destroyed, replaced by the justice she had spent years evading. Detective Kevin Harmon's investigation had revealed systemic problems extending far beyond the country club. His recommendations led to new police protocols for handling discrimination complaints, mandatory cultural sensitivity training, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board with representatives from affected communities. The ripple effects continued expanding throughout the city. The Chamber of Commerce adopted new ethical guidelines. The Bar Association created a pro bono program for discrimination victims. Local colleges integrated the Rivera case into their ethics and civil rights curricula. James Rivera established the Community Access Scholarship Fund, providing full memberships and program access to 50 underprivileged youth annually. The scholarship recipients would learn golf, tennis, swimming, and leadership skills while building relationships across racial and economic lines. As Eleanor Hastings was led away in handcuffs, her era of discrimination and theft finally ended. But the positive changes she had inadvertently sparked were just beginning. The community had chosen healing over hatred, justice over revenge, and inclusive growth over exclusive privilege. The courthouse steps became an impromptu celebration of justice. Community members who had followed the trial embraced and shared their hopes for continued progress. Stephanie Lawson interviewed participants about the broader implications, her reporting helping other communities recognize and address their own discrimination problems. Dr. Vivian Caldwell's charity received not only the restitution money, but ongoing support from dozens of new donors inspired by the case. Her programs expanded to serve 3 times as many families, with waiting lists finally eliminated and new services added. The transformation that began with one family's humiliation had grown into a movement for citywide change. Eleanor Hastings' downfall served as both justice for past wrongs and a warning to others who might consider similar behavior. As the sun set over the courthouse, James Rivera stood with his family, attorney, and supporters, not celebrating an enemy's defeat, but acknowledging a community's commitment to justice. The real victory wasn't Eleanor Hastings' prison sentence, but the positive changes that would outlast everyone involved in the case. The legal system had worked, but more importantly, people had chosen to work together for justice. That collaboration would prove more powerful than any individual verdict. creating lasting change that honored both accountability. The golden afternoon sun cast long rays across the country club terrace, illuminating a scene of profound transformation. 6 months had passed since James Rivera's humiliation on these very grounds, and today the same space buzzed with anticipation for the club's first annual Diversity and Inclusion Gala. Natural skylight streamed through the glass ceiling of the main hall, while overhead fluorescent lighting ensured every corner remained brightly lit for the celebration ahead. James Rivera stood near the terrace railing, adjusting his navy blue suit jacket as he reviewed his keynote speech notes. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would deliver his message from the exact spot where Eleanor Hastings had grabbed his orange polo shirt and declared he didn't belong. Today, however, the atmosphere crackled with genuine excitement and community pride rather than the toxic entitlement that had poisoned this place months earlier. Diane Rivera approached her husband, stunning in her flowing red evening gown that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Her confident smile reflected the healing their family had experienced since that traumatic day. The pain in her eyes had been replaced by something stronger, a fierce pride in what her husband had accomplished through grace and determination rather than bitterness or revenge. "Are you ready for this?" Diane asked, straightening James's tie with gentle precision. "The whole community is here to celebrate what you've built from that terrible moment." James nodded, his gaze sweeping across the transformed space. "I keep thinking about that day when we were escorted out in shame. Now look at this place. Real change happened because people chose to do better." Linda Prescott moved confidently through the crowd in her elegant green dress and matching jacket, her posture reflecting the leadership role she had grown into since Eleanor Hastings' removal. As the new director of member relations and community outreach, she had spearheaded many of the club's inclusive initiatives with passion and skill that had impressed even the most skeptical board members. She approached the Rivera family with a warm smile, carrying a folder of program materials. "James, everything is ready for your presentation. The community response has been overwhelming. We have representatives from 12 local organizations here tonight, plus several families whose children have already benefited from your scholarship programs." The transformation in Linda was remarkable. Gone was the nervous woman in her green blouse who had cowered under Eleanor Hastings' toxic leadership. In her place stood a confident professional who had found her voice and used it to create meaningful change throughout the organization. Gerald Sutton emerged from the main hall, dignified in his crisp blue jacket and dress shirt. The elderly board member had become an unlikely ally and friend to James Rivera, his initial shock at Eleanor Hastings' racism evolving into genuine commitment to institutional reform. His weathered hands carried index cards for his introduction speech, though his voice had grown stronger and more authoritative in recent months. "James, the crowd is seated and ready," Gerald announced with evident pride. "I've been in this club for 37 years, and I've never seen our members more engaged and enthusiastic about our community mission. What you've accomplished here goes far beyond what any of us imagined possible." Marcus Rivera and Sarah Rivera approached their parents, both teenagers glowing with confidence in their formal attire. Marcus wore a sharp black suit with orange tie, while Sarah looked elegant in her burgundy dress. Their posture and expressions reflected the personal growth they had experienced through this journey, transforming from traumatized victims into empowered young leaders. "Dad, did you see the Youth Leadership Award display?" Sarah asked excitedly. "There are photos of all 12 scholarship recipients from this year, plus the mentorship program participants." Mrs. Prescott said 3 colleges have already reached out about partnership opportunities. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "And the community service projects are expanding. Next month we're helping Dr. Caldwell's charity organize their biggest fundraiser yet. It feels amazing to be part of something that's actually making a difference." Detective Kevin Harmon arrived in his dress uniform, his muscular frame commanding respect as he joined the gathering. His long-sleeved formal jacket bore commendation ribbons, including a recent award for community policing excellence. The protocols he had developed for handling discrimination complaints had become a model for other departments throughout the state. "James, I wanted you to know that the training program we discussed is being implemented in 6 more precincts," Detective Harmon reported with satisfaction. Your story has become a powerful teaching tool for helping officers understand the real impact of institutional bias and the importance of taking discrimination complaints seriously. Dr. Vivian Caldwell approached the group, radiant in her red dress and matching jacket. Her charity had indeed expanded to serve 3 times as many families, with the Rivera Foundation's continued support enabling programs she had only dreamed about 6 months earlier. Her confidence and energy reflected the profound impact that adequate funding and community support had made on her organization's mission. "James, I can't thank you enough for what your foundation has made possible," Dr. Caldwell said warmly. "We've been able to provide comprehensive services to over 300 families this year. The scholarship fund alone has changed the trajectory for dozens of young people who never imagined they could access these opportunities." As the group moved toward the main hall, James noticed familiar faces throughout the crowd. Many were former witnesses to his humiliation, who had since become active supporters of the club's inclusive initiatives. Their transformation from passive bystanders to engaged community members represented one of the most meaningful aspects of this entire journey. Stephanie Lawson, the investigative reporter whose coverage had sparked citywide reforms, approached with her camera operator. Her orange blouse and black skirt reflected her professional demeanor as she prepared to document this culminating celebration for the follow-up story she was developing. "James, would you mind if we capture a few moments of your speech tonight?" Stephanie asked. "The community response to our original coverage has been incredible, and people want to see how this story of transformation continues to unfold." Linda Prescott moved to the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system as she addressed the packed room. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Gala. 6 months ago, this club failed to live up to its stated values in a moment that brought shame to our institution. Tonight, we celebrate not just our commitment to do better, but the remarkable leader who showed us what true grace under pressure looks like." The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause, a stark contrast to the cruel laughter that had echoed through these halls during James Rivera's humiliation. The transformation in community sentiment was complete and genuine, built on months of hard work and demonstrated commitment to inclusive values. Linda continued her presentation, outlining the concrete changes that had been implemented. "Our new membership policies have resulted in a 40% increase in diversity among club members. Our community outreach programs serve 8 local schools, and our scholarship fund has provided access to club facilities and programs for 57 young people from underserved communities." Gerald Sutton took the podium next, his voice strong and clear despite his advanced years. "I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, but first I want to acknowledge something important. James Rivera had every right to seek revenge after the treatment he received here. Instead, he chose transformation. He showed us that true leadership means lifting others up rather than tearing them down." The audience responded with sustained applause, many people rising to their feet in recognition. James felt Diane squeeze his hand as their children beamed with pride beside them. This moment represented not just personal vindication, but the realization of a vision for what communities could accomplish when they chose love over hate. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Eleanor Hastings sat in her prison cell, her former life completely destroyed by the choices she had made. Her racism and embezzlement had cost her everything: career, reputation, freedom, and family relationships. The woman who had once wielded power through cruelty and discrimination now faced the consequences of her actions in solitude and disgrace. James Rivera approached the podium to thunderous applause, his presence commanding the room through quiet dignity rather than intimidation. The same man who had been forcibly removed from this building now stood as its moral center, having transformed institutional failure into community triumph through grace and determination. 6 months ago, I stood on that terrace as a victim of hatred and discrimination. James began, his voice carrying easily throughout the hall. Today I stand here, not as someone seeking revenge, but as a member of a community that chose to grow. True victory doesn't come from destroying our enemies. It comes from creating something better than what existed before. The crowd listened intently as James continued, his words weaving together themes of forgiveness, justice, and collective responsibility. He spoke about the power of communities to choose love over hate, progress over stagnation, and inclusion over exclusion. His speech acknowledged the pain of discrimination while celebrating the possibility of transformation. Eleanor Hastings made choices that destroyed her life and hurt many people, James concluded. But we made different choices. We chose to build rather than tear down, to include rather than exclude, to love rather than hate. That's the legacy I want our children to inherit. Not perfect institutions, but communities committed to doing better every single day. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with many audience members openly emotional as they processed the journey from that dark day of humiliation to this moment of celebration and hope. The transformation was complete, not just in policies and procedures, but in hearts and minds throughout the community. As the evening concluded with music and conversation, James Rivera surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The same terrace where he had faced hatred now hosted conversations between people of different backgrounds, united in their commitment to building something better together. Real change had happened because people chose to do the hard work of transformation rather than accepting the status quo. The Rivera family drove home that night knowing they had witnessed something rare and precious, a community's genuine evolution from exclusion to inclusion, made possible not through force or revenge, but through the patient work of love and justice combined. Their story had become a testament to the power of grace under pressure and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest moments. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.